In the 16th century, England was nothing like the global power we imagine today. It was a relatively poor and not particularly influential country on the edge of Europe. It had no vast colonies, no dominant navy, and no steady flow of gold from the New World. But within just 2 centuries, everything changed. This small island kingdom turned into a global empire, with territories spread across the planet. How did that happen? In the second half of the 1500s, England was sliding into a financial crisis. People were restless and increasingly disobedient, and the legal system had become unpredictable and often brutal. It was clear this could spiral into deeper problems: internal division, maybe even civil war. Something had to be done, and quickly. At the time, the most profitable business was trade with newly discovered lands. But that market was already dominated by Spain and Portugal, while Venice still controlled much of Mediterranean trade. It was in this difficult moment that the young Elizabeth I came to the throne. She immediately took charge. Early attempts to reach the wealthy lands of spices and precious goods failed. Colonies collapsed, from disease, starvation, or interference from rival powers. Shut out of the world's riches, England chose a different path. It turned pirates into privateers. A privateer was essentially a pirate working for the state. They bought a royal license, a letter of marque, which allowed them to attack enemy merchant ships legally. They could dock in English ports, repair their ships, and resupply. Officially, they were private individuals. In reality, they were a covert weapon of the crown. They carried out the government's will. But if they were captured, England simply denied any connection. It was this state of affairs was unacceptable to Philip II of Spain. The very existence of Protestant England was an irritation to His Catholic Majesty. To invade the British Isles, Spain assembled a massive fleet, around 130 ships, including 22 heavy galleons. Even before setting sail, it was confidently named the Invincible Armada. Panic spread in London. The troops on board were enough to conquer all of England. The English fleet, even with Dutch support, looked modest by comparison. Smaller, lighter ships against Spain's floating fortresses. But the English had something else: experienced seamen, part sailors, part pirates, like Francis Drake and Martin Frobisher, favorites of Elizabeth I. In late July, the Armada entered the English Channel, forming a crescent-shaped battle line. The English avoided a full-scale confrontation. Instead, for a week, they harassed the Spanish from a distance, landing constant mosquito bites. 2 major ships were disabled, forcing the Armada to anchor near Calais. That night, the English sent in fire ships. Panic broke out. Spanish crews cut their anchor lines and scattered, damaging their own formation in the chaos. Attempts to regroup failed, and then the weather turned. A powerful storm stripped the heavy galleons of maneuverability. In the end, the fleet turned north, attempting to sail around Britain and Ireland. The retreat was disastrous. Spain lost around 60 ships, most of them wrecked along the coast by storms. While Spain was counting its losses, Elizabeth made her move. She set her sights on breaking into the lucrative spice trade and Eastern commerce. To do so, she backed a new venture, the East India Company, and entrusted expeditions to seasoned figures like Francis Drake and James Lancaster. In its early years, the company's business model looked familiar: raiding, seizing cargo, and pushing its way into established trade routes. Unlike the Portuguese and the Dutch, the English initially had no trading posts in India, but luck and timing were on their side. In a naval clash near the port of Surat, 4 English ships defeated 4 Portuguese vessels. Local rulers were watching closely and quietly rooting for the English, who seemed far more reasonable than the often brutal Portuguese. As a result, the Mughal Emperor Jahangir granted the English permission to establish a trading post. To colonize North America, England created 2 separate companies. The London Company received rights to the southern part of the coast, while the Plymouth Company was assigned the north. Officially, both claimed a noble mission, spreading Christianity. But the royal charters were far more direct: find and extract gold, silver, and copper by any means possible. In reality, no precious metals were found. The only valuable resource turned out to be timber for shipbuilding. The first English colony that actually managed to survive in the New World was Jamestown, founded in 1607. At first, it was on the brink of collapse. But everything changed when one of the settlers developed a new, highly demanded variety of tobacco. From that point on, things took off. Tobacco became the backbone of the economy, and Jamestown became the first stable English foothold in America. Sensing profit, the English crown announced a full-scale colonization of North America. But there was a problem. No one really wanted to cross the ocean to lands filled with hostile unknowns. So the ships were loaded with people who had little to lose: bankrupts, adventurers, victims of religious persecution, even criminals. They called themselves pilgrims. What held them together wasn't ideology, but necessity, shared risks and shared goals. To the crown, they were simply a tool for expansion and profit. In 1620, the Pilgrims received the right to settle in North America. More than 100 of them set sail aboard the Mayflower. After 2 months at sea, harsh weather pushed them off course, and they landed further north than planned, near present-day Plymouth. They were met by a wary and often hostile local population. But the Pilgrims weren't exactly timid. A few musket volleys were enough to send a clear message about who intended to stay. With the founding of Plymouth Colony, English expansion in North America became steady and irreversible. Colonists didn't rely only on force. They also used diplomacy. At first, some agreements with Native Americans were relatively fair. For example, William Penn, starting in 1682, made a series of treaties in which he paid for land, traded goods, respected boundaries, and maintained relatively peaceful relations. But the next generation was far less honest. In treaties where land was measured by a day's walk, the English redefined the rules, sending their fastest runners along prepared paths, claiming far more land than Native Americans had expected. Eventually, two distinct English societies emerged along the East Coast. In the South, Virginia, a slave-based colony populated by outcasts, loyalists of the Anglican Church, and African slaves. In the North, Massachusetts, part of New England, settled mostly by religious dissenters and advocates of free labor. Southerners came to be known as Virginians, Northerners as Bostonians or Yankees. They differed in background, beliefs, and way of life, but they all began the same way: by staining the land of their new home with native blood. Over time, Britain grew disappointed with its New World colonies. Instead of the expected mountains of gold and silver, ships kept arriving with timber, bundles of tobacco, and animal furs. It brought profit, but nowhere near what London had hoped for. To squeeze more out of the colonies, Britain raised taxes and banned trade with anyone but the metropole, effectively creating a strict monopoly. The colonies, filled with adventurers, outcasts, and victims of the British system, turned to smuggling. At the same time, resentment toward British policies slowly evolved into ideas of independence. By the 18th century, America had become Britain's primary destination for convicts. Thousands were shipped across the ocean to ease overcrowded prisons and used as cheap labor in the colonies. But once the colonies rebelled and gained independence, Britain lost its main dumping ground for prisoners. For a time, authorities tried sending convicts to British possessions in West Africa, but the climate proved brutal. Disease and high mortality quickly showed it was a dead end. That's when Britain came up with a brilliant idea. Why not send prisoners to Australia? The plan quickly turned into action. In May 1787, a fleet set sail from England. Its goal was to establish the first European colony in New South Wales. The landing followed the familiar script of the era: cannon fire, settlers stepping ashore, and the land declared property of the British Crown. But the initial optimism didn't last long. Australia turned out to be far harsher than expected. Exhausted after the long voyage, the settlers had to clear massive trees, prepare the land, and somehow grow crops on rocky soil. Most of them had never farmed before. Wheat, maize, and vegetables, planted hastily and without experience, barely grew. Food supplies dwindled fast, and the colony hovered on the edge of starvation. Only the arrival of a second ship, bringing provisions and new convicts, saved the settlement from collapse. Back in London, it slowly became clear: Australia was not another America or India. There was no gold, no silver, no easy wealth. Colonization moved slowly, and the population consisted mostly of convicts, guards, and a small number of farmers. Everything changed in 1851 when gold was discovered on the continent. A true gold rush began. Now, it wasn't just prisoners and soldiers coming. but thousands of people chasing the dream of quick riches. That's when Australia's population finally began to grow rapidly. By the mid-19th century, the British had pushed all their rivals out of India. The country's vast resources were being funneled back to Britain. Yet India was still governed not directly by the Crown, but by the East India Company. The company had its own officials, its own fleet, and even its own army. Much of that army consisted of sepoys, Indian soldiers. Many of them willingly joined, since the pay was relatively good by local standards. But arming a conquered population was a risky move. In 1857, the sepoys revolted, sparking a wave of uprisings across northern India. The rebellion was eventually crushed by the regular British army, but it sent a clear message. The company was no longer capable of controlling such a vast territory. As a result, power was transferred directly to the crown, and Queen Victoria was proclaimed Empress of India. From that point on, India saw the construction of railways, bridges, irrigation systems, telegraph lines, and even universities. But these developments were not meant to benefit the local population. They were tools of economic exploitation. Wealth flowed out of India rather than being reinvested into its development. Only a small minority of Indians had access to the benefits of modernization. The colony was used primarily to produce raw materials, cotton, yarn, jute, rather than finished goods. Indian-owned businesses were often suffocated by heavy taxation. Meanwhile, in Bengal, the British noticed something else. The local population had developed a strong appetite for opium. Seeing an opportunity, they began cultivating it on an industrial scale. At first, they flooded Bengal with it. Then they tried exporting it to Europe, but demand there remained limited. So they started looking for new markets. Their attention turned to China. At the time, China was the richest country in Asia. It traded in highly sought-after goods: silk, porcelain, tea, works of art. But the Chinese insisted on one thing: they would only trade in exchange for silver or gold, and they strictly limited foreign imports. The result was a growing imbalance. China grew richer, while Britain ended up with tea and empty pockets. Naturally, British merchants began asking, what could they sell to China in exchange for silver? The answer was opium. By addicting Chinese consumers, British traders began pulling vast amounts of silver out of China. Part of that silver was used to buy Chinese goods, while the rest became pure profit. The trade was enormously lucrative. Back in Bengal, however, the consequences were devastating. Opium cultivation displaced food production, impoverished farmers, and led to famine and the deaths of millions. But profit outweighed all concerns. In China, alarm bells were ringing. The country was slowly turning into a nation of addicts. In an attempt to stop the crisis, the emperor banned the import and sale of opium. But prohibition only drove prices higher. Smuggling exploded, and trade volumes kept growing. What had once been small shipments turned into thousands of tons per year. Eventually, tensions boiled over. A British ship carrying opium arrived in Guangzhou, the only port open to foreign trade. Chinese authorities seized the cargo. British merchants, furious over their losses, responded with force, opening fire on Chinese vessels. This marked the beginning of the First Opium War, which China ultimately lost. Forced into submission, the Chinese government ceded Hong Kong to Britain, opened additional ports to foreign trade, and legalized the opium trade. When China later attempted to resist again, it faced the Second Opium War, this time with France joining Britain. Even Russia took part, acting as a mediator, while securing valuable territories in the north, including access to the Pacific coast and expanded trade rights. What's striking is that, for a long time, the map of Africa was barely filled in, except for the coastline. For centuries, Europeans stayed on the edges of the continent. Expeditions inland were held back by malaria, yellow fever, and a whole list of deadly debuffs. But the temptation was too strong. In just 2 decades, the map of Africa was almost completely redrawn, divided, claimed, and recolored. During this scramble, land became something to trade and bargain over. Europeans divided not only territories belonging to indigenous peoples, but even those held by other European powers, like Portugal. One of the key flashpoints between Britain and Germany in Africa became the two Boer republics, Transvaal, and Orange Free State. Germany, eager to expand into southern Africa, sought access to the coast, either by acquiring Delagoa Bay in Mozambique or the nearby Santa Lucia Bay. They even secured permission from a Zulu chief to build a railway linking the coast to the Transvaal. But the British outplayed them. They produced an older treaty from 1843 claiming the same bay, and, just to make the point clear, sent a warship. Germany, feeling left out of the colonial division of the world, began searching for allies. At times, it tried to align with Britain against France. At others, it explored forming a continental blockade against Britain, sometimes pursuing both strategies at once. In response, Britain strengthened ties with France and drew in the Russian Empire. Surrounded, Germany was forced to rely on weaker allies, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire. During World War I, this alliance began to crack, and London could see it. Britain was already anticipating victory and the spoils that would come with it. But the situation was still complicated. Defeating Germany would mean sharing the rewards not only with France but also with Russia. According to earlier agreements, Russia could claim parts of Poland, Austrian Galicia, and even control over the Bosporus and Dardanelles. Then, unexpectedly, fortune intervened. In 1917, the Russian Empire began to collapse. Economic crisis deepened, military losses mounted, and dissatisfaction spread through both society and the elite. Russia withdrew from the war and descended into revolution, beginning with the February Revolution. For Britain, this turned out to be a major advantage. With Russia out of the war, it lost any claim to the territories it had been promised. After World War I, Britain emerged as one of the main beneficiaries. It received mandates over Palestine and Iraq and came closer to realizing Cecil Rhodes's vision, a continuous chain of British territories stretching from Cape Town to Cairo. Although the railway meant to connect them was never fully built, the British Empire, the largest in human history, began to unravel soon after World War II. The country faced severe financial strain, the consequences of war, and food shortages. British society was no longer willing to bear the cost of maintaining an empire, and London gradually granted independence to its colonies. Yet the end of the empire did not mean the end of influence. Britain managed to preserve strong political, economic, and cultural ties with many former colonies. Some joined the Commonwealth, and countries like Canada and Australia still formally recognize the British monarch as their head of state. In the 21st century, Britain continues to operate through alliances and partnerships. Alongside the United States, Canada, Australia, and others, it remains active in global politics. Some historians argue that British influence never truly disappeared. It simply changed form, from direct colonial control to a network of political and economic alliances. Interestingly, in this video we barely touched on England itself. What it was like before the British Empire even existed. A time before Parliament, before gentlemen, before England as we know it. If you're curious how it all began, from the ancient Celts to the 16th century, I've covered that story in another video. It includes Celtic Britain, the Roman conquest, and the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons who reshaped the island. And of course, you can't talk about Britain without mentioning Scotland, the one country on the island that resisted English expansion for centuries and didn't give up an inch of land easily. How the Scots managed to stand against a stronger neighbor and eventually take the English throne is a story I tell in another video, which should be on your screen right now. If you want to understand how Britain itself was formed, definitely check it out. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.